We're happy to have via Skype Bryant Terry with us today. He's a chef and a cookbook author. He's also got a degree in history. He's been the humanities advisor on the Between Meals Cookbook Project. He's been featured in the New York Times and Food and Wine, Gourmet, Vegetarian Times, Color Lines, a bunch of other places. Listed by thegrio.com as one of the 100 African Americans making history today. And the San Francisco Bay Guardian named him the best cookbook cheftivist in the Bay Area. Lots of other accolades, but I will stop there and just and welcome you, Bryant, to our class. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me on.
So you've written, it looks like 5 books now, written or co-written?
4, actually.
4, okay. So I've got Recipes from America's Small Farms.
Oh, that was actually a book that I contributed to. So that was the first published recipe that I had was in that book, but it was an anthology.
Okay, and then you co-wrote Grub, Ideas for an Urban Organic Kitchen.
Yep.
And then author of probably your most famous book, Vegan Soul Kitchen, which won a bunch of awards. And
yeah.
And then The Inspired Vegan, Seasonal Ingredients, Creative Recipes, Mouth-Watering Menus, which is one that I have and cook from actually quite a bit. And very recently, just last year, Afro Vegan, Farm Fresh African, Caribbean, and Southern Flavors Remixed. So that's a pretty impressive set of books all in a row like that. How did you get into this sort of thing? What was the trajectory that got you into writing cookbooks and being a kind of activist and cookbook author?
Yeah. Well, as you said, I actually have a master's in American history from New York University, but I was actually in a PhD program when I started.
Okay.
And some of the research I was doing led me to the activism that was happening here in the San Francisco Bay Area in the late 60s and 70s. And I was really moved by this analysis that the Black Panthers had that looked at this intersection of poverty, malnutrition, and institutional racism. But more so moved by their programmatic responses to this. They had their grocery giveaways in which they were giving away thousands of pounds of groceries to low-income, working-class, working-poor residents of the Bay Area. But I think more than anything, I was moved by their free breakfast for children program, which was started in 1967. And part of their philosophy was that oppressed communities need to be educated in order to be liberated. And how could young people possibly assimilate what they were learning in schools if they were hungry? And so they started this program with the help of a reverend in West Oakland, California. And within 1 year, every major city that had a Black Panther chapter replicated the model, and they were feeding over 10,000 young people every single morning. Wow. It's interesting because when some of the FBI records were declassified, looking at their kind of the COINTELPRO's efforts to, just crush the Panthers, J. Edgar Hoover actually said that the Free Breakfast for Children program was the most dangerous project that the Black Panthers had created. And, part of it is because it actually moved, this kind of popular notion that the corporate controlled media had of them being just these crazy gun-toting militants. This program, along with a number of their programs, all on the rubric of their survival program, it moved the minds and hearts and spirits of people because it was addressing these basic core needs of people living in communities. And so at the time, I was, in addition to being a part of this academic communities, I was part of this, very vibrant activist community in New York. I was working on issues around kind of dismantling the prison industrial complex.
Oh, yeah, right.
Some stuff around, addressing the draconian, drug laws. And so I would go out to different communities that we were working in partnership with. And after learning about this work of the Panthers, it allowed me to look at these communities through a different lens. And so, I started making these connections, and the communities that statistically had some of the highest rates of hypertension, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, these preventable diet-related illnesses, were the same communities that when you walked around, you saw very few sources of accessing healthy, fresh, affordable, and culturally appropriate food. A friend of mine actually said in some of these communities you can get a handgun quicker than you can actually get a fresh apple. And there were the plethora of the work sources, lots of fast food restaurants, lots of the corner stores, bodegas, and we know that they were replete with processed foods, packaged food, cigarettes,
Yeah.
alcohol. And so I felt like the larger social justice movement that I was a part of was remiss if it didn't talk about this public health crisis,
Hmm.
if it didn't talk about this exponential rise in chronic illnesses that we've seen over the past several decades, if it didn't talk about solutions for kind of helping people living in the communities that are most impacted by food insecurity or food injustice, if you will,
Hmm.
owning and driving the solutions to creating more community food security
Hmm.
and access to healthy, affordable food in those communities. And so I decided I wanted to start a program that addressed this, and I knew I wanted to take a different route. One of the, at the time I was going to a lot of conferences.
Sure.
I started, just trying to get a sense of what was the national response to a lot of these issues around food insecurity and food injustice. And I would go to conferences, and it struck me that there were very few people at the conference, and certainly not at the leadership tables. Very few people who were coming from the most impacted communities.
Hmm.
Whether we're talking about small farmers, whether we're talking about low income people living in urban centers, low income folks living in rural areas. And so,
So it's people theorizing the problems, but not anyone who's actually experienced it.
I mean, a
Yeah.
few, but so many other people had very little direct experience with these issues. And
Yeah.
I just felt like the approaches, they kind of smacked to this early 20th century social worker model where you had like the, more privileged, educated, mostly white women kind of patrolling the boundaries of class and
Hmm.
policing the behavior of poor people.
Hmm.
And, I felt like the conversation started with the heady intellectual ideas. They started with the public policy issues, but they failed to really recognize the brilliance and the problem solving abilities of the people who are actually impacted by these issues. And I thought, what a more powerful way to bring the most people into the conversation um, than by using food, cooking itself.
Right.
Because I don't even want to talk about how at some of these national conferences around food, the food was horrible.
Yeah,
That's a
yeah,
whole
yeah,
other
yeah.
conversation.
That's still true in philosophy for sure. Yeah.
But yeah, so my kind of guiding philosophy since then has been start with the visceral, move to the cerebral, and end at the political. Understanding
Hmm.
that these are deeply political issues, and we need to address, food insecurity. We need to
Sure.
talk about our runaway food system. All these issues through high-level public policy
Hmm.
and local public policy.
Hmm.
But you know, that's in my opinion, not the most effective way to get the most people to the table. And I found that this thing, cooking, that's so primal, that's so visceral, that's so immediate,
Yeah.
that's so tactile, connecting around the table and actually kind of, looking at the table and the kitchen as places that, kind of catalyze the movement. I mean,
Uh-huh.
if we think about the 20th century, so many of the social movements in the United States, were had in people's homes, in kitchens, around tables, the strategizing, the educating,
Hmm.
the organizing, particularly the civil rights movement. And so I just felt like that would be a powerful way to really excite people to be more invested in this movement that we call food justice.